Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be introducing some more conditional control structures. In particular, we're going to be introducing the else, if, and the switch statement. So as mentioned, we're going to introduce the control structure that's called an else if statement, which is actually used in combination with an if statement, which we've already learned about. We're going to learn about a switch statement, which allows you to evaluate different statements based on the value of a certain variable. And we're going to talk about something known as the default case, which applies to switch statements. And then we're just going to quickly go over coding conventions as it relates to these two types of control structures we're introducing. So basically, an else if statement is a conditional control structure that you can associate to an if statement, like an else statement that we had learned about. The difference between an else and an else if statement, and one thing I should mention again is that an else if statement is technically not a statement as far as PHP goes, but that's commonly what it's referred to. The difference between an else and an else if statement is that the else if the true condition, if the test condition for the if statement is false, the else if statement has another test condition that it evaluates, and it only evaluates its code segment if that is true. So for example, this is an example of an if statement combined with an else if statement. So here we have if and then test condition 1. If test 1 is true, the if statement group gets executed and execution continues down at the bottom. Now if this test condition equals false, instead of going down to an else statement, we go down to an else if statement. And basically this provides another test that we evaluate. And then this section associated with the else if statement only gets executed if test 2 is equal to true. So basically it allows us a way to add another test to another test condition to decide what type of code or which section of code to evaluate on. So again, this section is only going to get evaluated if test 1 from the if statement was false and then test 2 was equal to true. Now one of the nice things you can do with else if statements is you can chain multiple else if statements together. And you can do that as often as you need it. So basically, in this case, we have an if statement with two else if statements appended to it. And basically, the same rules apply as we just talked about. For example, this statement group only gets executed if test 1 is false and test 2 is true. However, if it comes down here, test 1 is false, test true ends up being false, it goes on to the next else if block and evaluates test 3. If test 3 is equal to true, then it evaluates test 3 statement. However, if none of the test conditions apply, then you actually just exit the entire control structure set and you continue with whatever statement is next in line. So let's actually take a look at an example of the else if statement in action. So for example, this is a script I've written called elseif.php, and it accepts one get variable called num, N-U-M, and you set that equal to a numerical value. And basically, what we have is a couple of else if statements that will conditionally execute or echo a statement depending on the value of the number that's passed in. So for example, the first test is if num, and in our code, we actually, num is a short variable created for the get variable num. If num is equal to no, which means it wasn't passed in, then we echo no number was provided. If num is less than 0, we write the number provided as negative. If it's greater than 0, we write the number provided as positive. If none of these conditions are met, which is only the case if num equals 0, then we just move on to the next statement, which would be down here. So actually, let's just go ahead and show you how this works. So if we go ahead and we put num equals, well, first of all, actually, let's just look at the page where we don't put any input. We haven't included any num statement. Down at the bottom here, we can see the results. And this first result here applies to this first else if statement. We can see the message no number was provided, which means that num equals null, and this section was executed. And let's go ahead and enter num equals 100, which is a positive number. And when we do that, because num, what's going to happen is this code's going to be entered. It's going to say, is num equal to no? It's going to say false. Num is equal to 100. Is num less than 0? That test is going to return false. And then it's going to go down here and say is num greater than 0, 100 is greater than 0. This is going to execute to true, or evaluate to true. So this echo statement gets executed. If we look down at results, it outputs that statement. The number provided is positive. Now if we go up here and we change this num to equal negative 100, and we hit enter, the same process is going to happen. Num is not going to be equal to null, but what it's going to do is when it reaches the first else if statement, it's going to say num is less than 0. That's going to evaluate to true. So this echo statement is going to be output, and then because this condition was met, this following else if statement doesn't even get evaluated. This test condition never gets evaluated, and execution would jump immediately to the following line of code. So if we look at the result, we could see the number provided is negative. Now, one of the things that we can do, as we could do with an if statement, is we can actually add an else statement to a group of if and else if statements. And basically what happens is the else statement group gets executed if none of the conditions in the original if or any of its associated else if statements evaluate to true. And this right here is an example of this sort of structure. It's got an if statement, followed by an else if statement, followed by an else. What happens is if test 1 equals true, it goes ahead and evaluates this group, jumps to the bottom down here, and evaluates the next line of code after all of these structures. If test 1 is false, it goes down here and evaluates condition test 2. As we know from else if, what we learned about else if this is true, then this statement group gets executed, and again, we would jump out to here. Now, if test 1 is false, and then we go down here and test 2 is false, then else gets executed no matter what, and in this case it's going to execute whatever the else statement group is. So if we actually go back and look at our elseif.php file, we have another section of else if statements here, except that's exactly the same as before, except we've added an else statement here. And what we had talked about before was that this first group of if, else, if statements, they'll always enter at least one of these statements unless the number is 0. So in this case, if it's equal to null, the first one's executed. If it's negative, the second one is executed. If it's positive, the other one is executed. But if it's 0, it's going to meet none of these. So in this case, we can add an else statement that says basically if you get to this section, the number you provided is 0, and it's going to say the number provided was 0. So actually if we go ahead and we output the number 0, or input the number 0, and refresh the page, we can see two things. We can see, one, the output for this bottom section with the else statement says the number provided was 0, and that's because of our else statement. We also can see that nothing was output for the first section of if-else statements, and that's because 0 meant none of these conditions. It wasn't equal to null, it wasn't less than 0, and it wasn't greater than 0. So again, these else-if blocks only get evaluated if one of their conditions is true. If not, execution just jumps to immediately afterwards. So the next control structure we're going to introduce is known as a switch statement. And basically what that does is that compares a single test expression against a number of different values, and then evaluates, which are called cases, and then evaluates any code or statements associated with those cases. So for example, this is the syntax of what it looks like. It's a switch keyword, and then it's followed by an expression in parentheses. In this case, it's a variable called number, num, that's going to hold a number value. And then what you can see here is within the switch statement, which is denoted, as with the other control structures, by curly braces, it has a number of different cases. It has case 1 here, or it has case here, which is 1, that says if num, the value of num is equal to 1, then you echo these, then you process these statements here. If num is equal to 2, then you process these statements here. If num doesn't equal to any of these, none of them get processed, and execution jumps out to the end of the script. Now, one thing to note is that the case values, here's another example, case values can only be scalar values, so they can be strings, integers, bools, and floats, or they can be the value null. They can't be things such as arrays and so forth, or objects. Basically, also what happens is if, on the last slide, you'll notice that after each statement in our case statement, we had a second statement that was break. And this break statement is a special statement. And what it does is, the way switch operates is you input a value or expression, and then it goes down linearly from top to bottom, evaluating each case and saying, is the value passed in equal to this case? And then what it does is once it finds a case that matches, it goes ahead and it runs every statement until it either reaches a break statement or the end of the switch statement. So in this case, because there's no break here after the first case statement, if the name passed in is the string Joe, what's going to happen is it's going to say, okay, I match here, so I'm going to evaluate this case. I'm going to evaluate this statement here, so it's going to echo name is Joe. But then there's no break statement. And as mentioned, the switch statement continues to execute statements until it either reaches a break statement or the end of the switch statement. So there's no break statement here, so actually what it does is it goes down here. It's going to output this line as well. It's going to echo name is John. Then it's going to reach the end of the switch statement and it's going to stop. So this is probably not the behavior that would be desired, and so that's where break statements come into use. So typically to make this function as we'd want it to, we would add a break statement below here and then a break statement below here as well. So let's actually take a look at a code example or some code examples using the switch statement. Let's go to switch.php, which is an example file. And here we have a switch statement that tests that uses as its value to compare against the value of the variable called phone, which for this script is actually phone is a short variable for a get variable that's passed in called phone. And we're going to have it for this script that phone can take on the different string values, home, work, or cell. And so what happens is if we were to pass in a get parameter, in this case, this original page, we just have switch.php with no query string. So phone is actually going to get set equal to null because we've used a ternary operator to process the get variable. And the way we do that is if the get variable phone is set, we set it to the value. If not, we set it equal to null. So if nothing is passed in, we go down here, we reach the case null. It's going to echo no phone number was provided, and then it's going. You'll notice the break statement here, which means none of the rest of the echo of these statements are going to get evaluated, and so it's going to jump to the end of the switch statement and break out of it, which is where the name break comes from. So if we look down at our results for the first output, it say no phone number was provided. Now for these other ones, it has a case for if you provide home, it's going to say the phone number provided was home, the phone number provided was work if you provide the name work, and so on for cell. So if we just go through actually and just try out some of these and say phone equals home, you can see down here at the bottom it says phone number provided was home, and that echoes this statement right here because when phone variable was passed into the switch statement, it didn't match null, but it did match home. And then just to do one more as an example, we'll put in cell. And what's going to happen is this switch statement is going to get evaluated. Phone's going to be compared to null. It's in this case it's the string cell, so this is not going to be evaluated. It's not going to be equal to home, so this case and its associated statements are not going to be evaluated. It doesn't equal work, so this isn't going to be evaluated. And then at the same time, it does equal cell, so this one's going to get evaluated. So when we refresh the page, if we go look at the bottom, we can see the phone number provided was cell. Now let's say we actually provided one other scenario. Let's say we provided something that said cell 2. I want my phone number. Maybe this is a script that processed different phone numbers, and it said I want to update my phone cell 2. And if we go ahead and enter that, you'll notice that there's actually no output here, and that's because when phone equals cell 2 and it enters the switch statement, the switch statement is going to compare cell 2, the string cell 2, to each of these different cases. Because it doesn't equal any of these cases, none of these statements gets executed. So that's actually going to bring us to another interesting point we're going to talk about, which is called the default case. And basically this is kind of similar to an else statement that gets appended to a series of if statements. And basically what that does is it states that it uses the keyword default. And basically what it states is that if you enter this switch statement and you compare the expression passed in this case is the variable num, and it doesn't match any of the cases, then by default it's going to always run this statement group here. So in this example, if num equaled, for example, the integer 2, we would come down here, it would say case equals 0, 2 doesn't equal 0, it wouldn't evaluate this. It would compare 0 to 1, that would evaluate to false, so it wouldn't go here. Then we reach the default section and says, well, it hasn't reached any of these other these, we're always going to go ahead and output this here. And we can make use of that in our script. If we go back here and we have the same, here we have a switch statement. It's the same, for this part right here, it's the same as we had before in this top example, except we've added a default case. And so what that's going to do is, as you notice, when we entered cell 2 as the value of phone, you can see that nothing was output for this top if statement because it fell through all of these cases and had no default output. But down here we have a default case that says if you compare phone to each of these cases and it doesn't match any of them, then you go ahead and output this default statement. In this case, we're just echoing a statement that says the phone number will be set to home. And as you can see, that's what happened. So just to quickly, we're going to talk about coding conventions. Basically, for else if statements, the same coding conventions are going to apply as we use for if statements as far as parentheses and spaces and curly braces go. The switch statement also is going to have similar code formatting. If we actually go and look at the code, the one thing you'll notice is, like with our if statement, there'll always be a space between the switch keyword and the opening parentheses of the test condition. The opening curly brace will be on the same line as the switch statement, and there'll be a space between that and the closing parenthesis. In addition, each case keyword, or each case, will be indented one indent further in, or one indent deeper than the switch statement. So you can see all of these cases are indented one further. And then within under each case statement, all of the statements that are part of the case statement group will also be indented one relative to the case. So you actually see here we have 3 different indent levels. Finally, the closing brace, like our if and else statements, is going to be on a line all by itself, and it's going to be aligned at the same indent level as the switch keyword. The other thing I'm going to mention is that the default case, when we use a default case in our switch statements, we're always going to put it as the last case. Now, technically, you don't have to do that, but that's typically the convention, and it makes sense. Is like with our if-else statements, else is always at the bottom. Well, with the switch statement, we're always going to put the default case at the bottom, and in additionally, we're always going to add a break statement to our default case. Now, technically, because the default case will always be at the bottom, as we described, whenever its statements are done executing, it's going to reach the end of the switch statement, and so it will stop executing because we know a switch statement executes everything from the case it matches until it reaches a break or end of statement. That said, we're always going to include that break statement. That would be for reasons in case somebody decides to add an extra case at the bottom below our default statement or something like that, and it's just to sort of improve the robustness of our code. So for the homework challenge for today, I want to have you create a script that basically accepts one get variable named action, and we're going to let action take on one of 3 string values, 1, 2, or 3, which basically correlate to 3 different actions that a script might perform. I want you to use the ternary operator like we had used in our web application to create a short variable called action. That gets set to the value that was supplied for action. If it was supplied, it gets set to null if no value was provided. Then I want you to use a set of if, else if, and else statements to do 3 things. If no action was provided, which would mean action is equal to null, then you provide an error message saying no action was provided. If it's the value is 1, 2, or 3, then I want you to output a separate message for each of those saying action 1 will be performed, action 2 will be performed, action 3 will be performed. If action is specified, but it has an action name that's not 1, 2, or 3, for example, let's say the user specified action equals 4, then I want you to output a message saying that some default action was performed instead. Be sure to test these conditional statements that you create, and you can do that by, you should use the name value pairs name equals 1, name equals 2, and name equals 3 to verify that you definitely get the output that says action 1, action 2, or action 3 was performed, as well as providing something where it says name equals xxx, where xxx is not 1, 2, or 3. In this case, or as we just mentioned, we could say name equals 4. The other thing is also want to not provide the variable name. And actually, this is a little bit of a typo. These actually should be action equals 1, 2, or 3. So the other thing you should do is not provide the action variable at all, and you should output the message correspondingly that says no action variable was provided. Then what I want you to do is go ahead and convert that if-else statement group all into one switch statement that has a default case. And if you remember, the default case sort of corresponds to an else statement. And then test your switch statement with the same inputs you used up here in test 4, and make sure you get the same output as required. And be sure to format your else if and your switch statements according to the course's coding conventions that we had talked about. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.